Hello, everyone. I am very pleased to introduce Professor Margery Sabin, who is the Lorraine Chiu Wang Professor of English and the Director of the South Asia Studies Program here at Wellesley. Professor Sabin is also on the faculty of the Bread Loaf School of English, a summer master's program designed especially for high school English teachers. Her PhD is in comparative literature from Harvard University. In recent years, Professor Sabin's teaching, research, and publications have increasingly concerned Victorian, modern, and contemporary writings related to British imperialism and post-colonial writing, specifically South Asian and Irish. Her courses on these subjects at Wellesley and Bread Loaf include Modern Indian Literature, Fiction of Empire and the Breakup of Empire, Modern Irish Literature, and Wit and Terror in Modern Irish Literature. These teaching interests also inform her most recent book, Dissenters and Mavericks, Writing About India and English, 1765 to 2000, along with articles and book reviews about a variety of related topics, including the increasing phenomenon of writers migrating between nations, languages, and social classes. In the fall, Professor Sabin will be teaching a course on modern Indian literature, and she would love to see some Albright Fellows there. Please join me in welcoming Professor Margery Sabin.
Hi, I don't think I'm going to try sitting on the table, so I hope you will mind my standing here. The questions and issues that came up after my colleague Larry Rosenwald's talk are so rich we could go on all day, and also makes me wish I had a different talk that addressed those questions. But I hope you'll find a lot of overlap and that we can return to some of the questions that already came up. But I am going to ask you to be able to shift gear in some significant way that I haven't fully formulated since listening to the earlier discussion. Two things that strike me is that one, I'm going to be talking much less about authority and power of literature as it might play out in the public sphere, and I'm going to be asking you to think of yourselves much more as readers reacting to literature as you proceed to prepare here in this wonderful opportunity you have, prepare for exciting internships you may be doing, and then later in your life, work in the public sphere, and what value the reading of literature might have for you in a more direct and personal way. The other thing that I guess I should mention is that there is a somewhat temperamental difference between Larry Rosenwald and myself, so that he comes to the word utopian much more often than I do, and tends to think of happiness and flourishing, and whereas I, for reasons I don't know exactly, tend to think of unhappiness and dilemmas and conflicts of emotions. So we'll just leave that there. But I do think that this shift of my own emphasis might come out best if I talk about one of the most memorable interludes of teaching I've had in my career. And that was for 3 or 4 years during the 1980s when I had the opportunity to be part of a program called Literature and the Professions that was run by a former judge. It was run out of Brandeis, and his experience had been with district court judges. District court judges in this country are very low-level, low-status judges, but they deal in very intimate ways with and have a lot of power in relation to people's personal experiences. They deal with family disputes, drug addiction, teenage crime, and various forms of juvenile and family upset. And so they have a lot of power in dispensing these cases, a lot of power over people's lives, but they're relatively isolated given confidentiality requirements and so on. So they have very little opportunity to consult with people about what their experience is as in these positions of considerable power. And it was this former judge's idea that a day off from work, which was already a privilege, but that a day devoted to the discussing of works of literature in a group with some literature professors as facilitators might have some reinvigorating effect on these professionals who frequently become quite depressed and burnt out in this role. And so I was part of that team. And it was really amazing the effect that this day had on these people. Some of them hadn't read a work of serious literature for, I don't know, 25 years, if ever. And they were so engaged, so moved by having this opportunity that the program became expanded to include other kinds of professionals. And I remember especially fascinating day with probation officers who have similar kinds of power, not a group known for high literary interests. So it was a humbling experience for me to see how close to the core of this writing they were able to come, left really without that much direction from the literature professors. Another day I remember, this was in the height of the AIDS epidemic, was a day that was spent with medical professionals who worked with AIDS patients. So this went on and was at an early stage of what has continued and grown to be the field of literature and the professions in terms of the training of especially medical students and law students. And it has been felt that this training provides an important supplement and humanizing influence on people whose reading is otherwise devoted to data and legal precedents and other rather depersonalized accounts of experience. So I am thinking of you here studying global affairs. You have not yet gotten burnt out from your experience because you haven't even begun. But still, you might have some responses. I had an email exchange with someone the other day when I said that I was going to be presenting something about literature at the Albright Institute, and along with my colleague Larry Rosenwald, and they said, "We're glad you're infiltrating the Albright Institute." So you'll excuse if we have a kind of advocacy tone here, that we do feel that we are on the outside. Now, so for this event, I was thinking of this experience that I had had, and I wanted readings that dramatized the kinds of dilemmas or conflicts you might encounter in your own experience. And the point that I didn't quite make about, say, the probation officers, they didn't want to read stories about the kinds of people who were on probation. They felt they knew about that, and whatever reading they might have done would have been sociological reading about who these people were, all the social problems that they had. The kind of reading that spoke to them most had to do with their own dilemmas at doing that job and their own conflicts of feeling and their own errors and frustrations. Now, the book that I first had in mind to do, and one that I highly recommend to you, was Catherine Boo's prize-winning book that you might know of, I hope, Beyond the Beautiful Forevers. Just won a National Book Award. And I got the idea of using that book, even though it's a nonfiction book, because it's about a slum in Mumbai, and the early reviews of it praised it for its novelistic character and qualities. And it is a wonderful book. It's an outstanding example of what's come to be called long-form reportage, in which it's become very popular because when it's really done well, it brings into human presence kinds of people, individuals, who are often not granted human stature either by the authorities where they live or even by parts of the population who are very nearby. And it's significant that Catherine Boo, the slum where she immersed herself for 4 years, neighbors the renovated, very fancy Mumbai airport, and now is bordered with 5-star hotels and separated from this slum by a wall and security personnel and a road. But it really exists as a pretty much separate world. And the book very much does succeed in giving you, through interviews that she conducted over this period of 4 years, through a translator, it must be admitted, it gives you a sense of the human individuality of these people and elicits a very strong feeling of sympathy for their predicament, for whatever faults she also is able to represent, have them represent in their own voices. But I decided not to do that book, partly because the very humanizing effect of the population that she's talking about, that's very well known as a reason to, say, include case studies or novels, even in legal training. And I didn't think that it quite added the particular focus that I wanted to do. And to give you the reason why it clarified what I want, for me, what I wanted to do, came from a more critical review of that book by a woman, a professor named Martha Nussbaum, who is one of the leaders of including literature in professional training, for using it. And I go back to Lara Rosenwald's discussion of the instrumental use of literature, which is what I think Martha Nussbaum is promoting. So she praises Boo's book for what she says it brings scenes vividly to life, and she says in her words, it has great power to provoke emotion, and so she praises it for all those reasons. But in the end, she's critical of the book because she says that it offers little, and these are her words, to channel that emotion into constructive political action. Now, that's a perfectly fair demand to make because of this book, because the situation is so extreme that just having empathy or sympathy for these people doesn't seem an adequate response, and one wants to know, well, then what? What are you going to do about this? But the harder question and the more uneasy question that I want to put to you is whether opening channels for political action is actually the sole or even the main value that literature might have to offer you, even if what you are engaged in is valuable political and social activity. So that's the question I want to think about, and it's not that obvious an answer. So my first text is a story by the current contemporary Pakistani-American writer Danial Muinuddin. Some of you may have already read. I teach his book in my modern Indian literature class. It's a book of short stories called In Other Rooms, Other Wonders, published just a few years ago in 2009. Now, these are works of fiction, but Muinuddin has explained that they draw on his childhood memories spent on his Pakistani father's farm in the Punjab. Muinuddin's life has a very novelistic shape of its own because he left that farm as a child. He was educated in the United States. He started a professional life in New York, And as a young man, his parents had separated. He had an American mother. His father summoned him to come back to Pakistan because the farm was about to go under economically, and unless he came there and saved it, it would be lost to the family. So then Muinuddin actually did that, and he's been there more or less for 20 years, and he has actually brought that farm, managed that farm back into economic prosperity, and at the same time, he's launched this writing career that's produced this book of stories. So the biggest challenge he faced in this endeavor was the rampant culture of corruption that had caused the economic collapse of the farm. But in the stories, you get the feeling that bribery, trickery, and payoffs are throughout the society, from the electrician to the police to the judiciary to the upper class to the landowners and their wives and everybody in between. Catherine Boo is presenting a version of that same culture of corruption in the slum world of India that she presents in her book. But Nawabdin Electrician is focused in a different way. It's focused sharply and ironically on a moral conundrum that he proceeds to explore in the other stories too. This is the first story in the book. And I think it engages the reader, it leaves the reader to ponder the dilemmas of moral judgment that do not lead, they don't lead in any obvious way, don't even arouse the question of what would be a policy for social reform. So what does it do? Well, first of all, in many ways, it's the most cheerful story in the book. The others are much bleaker. The character of Nawabdin is a happy fellow, which isn't true of many of the others in the book. He is very good at making his humble trade yield a pretty good living, and enough to provide for his wife and many daughters, a dozen daughters, he's given in this story, and he loves them and they love him, and the tone of the narrative is quite lighthearted and seems to embody his thriving. There's only a touch of irony in describing his self-satisfaction. For example, in the passage where he is looking in the mirror and thinking quite cheerily about how he's able to handle the expenses that are involved in marrying off all these daughters on the meager income of an electrician. So just to read a sentence from his point of view, another man might have thrown up his hands, but not Nawabdin. The daughters acted as a spur to his genius, and he looked with satisfaction in the mirror each morning at the face of a warrior going out to do battle. And the battle, the glorious battle that he does, involves illegally connecting the electricity off the grid and being paid off for it, and so on. So that is how he can be so successful. Now, a short story tends only to give space for one major event or reversal. And here, it's what happens, the setback, when Nawabdin is wounded during a bungled robbery by a low-down thief who is trying to rob his motorcycle, this motorcycle which he has manipulated the landowner into giving him. I hope you've read this story that I distributed to you. So he's wounded, but not that badly, and he recovers well. And so the question arises, what's the problem? And I'm not sure. I'm tempted to stop here, and those of you who've read the story ask you whether you think there is anything disturbing. And I have had the experience of teaching this story to students, and initially some see no problem at all. Nawabdin Yes, he does this to the electric company, but who knows about them? Who cares about them? And individually, he's a hardworking, responsible man in relation to his family, and he's been mugged by a low-down thief. The low-down thief has been more seriously wounded, shot, actually, what turns out to be fatally, by rescuers who've come to the scene of this would-be crime. So it's only on the last page and a half that if it's only on the last page and a half that the story abruptly shifts perspective and starts us to think really, what about this Nawabdin's self-satisfaction? And I'm just going to read a little bit of it. It's the robber's dying, and Nawabdin knows that he is going to recover. He's already recovering. The robber lay heaving, moving his fingers by his sides. The pharmacist seemed to have gone away somewhere, leaving them alone. They just said that I'm dying. Forgive me for what I did. I was brought up with kicks and slaps and never enough to eat. I've never had anything of my own. No land, no house, no wife, no money, never, nothing. I slept for years on the railway station platform in Multan. My mother's blessing on you. Give me your blessing. Don't let me die unforgiven. He began snuffling and coughing even more and then started hiccuping. Now the disinfectant smelled strong and good to Nawab. The floor seemed to shine. The world around him expanded. Never. I won't forgive you. You had your life. I had mine. At every step of the road, I went the right way and you the wrong. Look at you now with bubbles of blood stuck in the corner of your mouth. Do you think this isn't a judgment? My wife and children would have begged in the street, and you would have sold my motorbike to pay for 6 unlucky hands of cards and a few bottles of poison homebrew. If you weren't lying here now, you would already be in one of the gambling camps along the river. The man said, please. Please, please, more softly each time, and then he stared up at the ceiling. It's not true, he whispered. After a few minutes, he convulsed and died. The pharmacist, who had come in by then and was cleaning Nawab's wounds, did nothing to help him. Yet Nawab's mind caught at this, looking at the man's words and his death like a bird hopping around some bright object, meaning to peck at it. And then he didn't. He thought of the motorcycle saved and the glory of saving it. He was growing. 6 shots, 6 coins thrown down, 6 chances, and not one of them killed him. Not Nawabdin, electrician. So I like the end of the story. I think it makes it a much better story than it would be otherwise, because the focus is really on Nawabdin and not on the thief. We're not given enough detail to know whether this thief is telling the truth, whether he's being misjudged by Nawabdin. Maybe Nawabdin is right to think that he wouldn't succeed even if he got this motorcycle, that he would sell it, that he would waste the money. But what's interesting is how his own mind is just hopping around, a little self-doubt there for a minute. Is he absolutely right? Did he do everything right? Did the thief do everything wrong? Even his last comments suggest an element of luck that the pharmacist has already pointed out. You're lucky that that shot only hit you in the leg, and you were lucky. What role does luck play in the difference between the two of them? How much does it muddy the boundary between absolute right and absolute wrong? Nawabdin is not a great thinker. He has a rather limited consciousness. The story is turning around at the end to the limitation of that consciousness, that his mind hops around a little doubt, but it takes comfort pretty quickly in the more nourishing habit he has of self-congratulation. And so what I think the story does is invite the reader it allows the reader to probe a little more about those distinctions between the moral right and the moral wrong as one is thinking of the discrepancy between the Nawabdin type and the low-down thief type. Now, whether this has anything to do with any experience you might have as a reader, I don't know. We can think about it in discussion. My second text is much more intense and more disturbing and also more controversial. It's the last chapter of the notorious book by V.S. Naipaul called Area of Darkness. This book was widely vilified, especially by Indians, when it was published in 1964. And many of the questions that came up in the previous, after Larry's talk about truth in reportage, these are questions that were raised about Naipaul's book, because not only was it devoid of suggesting constructive political recommendations, but the emotions conveyed by his reaction to India were so negative as to seem destructive rather than constructive. Naipaul's version of India seemed so tainted by his very personal obsessions that it couldn't even stand as journalism, good journalism, no less good public policy suggestions. And yet, that book, Area of Darkness, remains compelling reading decades after, while many fairer and more objective accounts of India in the 1960s have come to be outdated, or they're just not really relevant now. And some readers actually regard this book to be one of Naipaul's best books, and still fresh, though still a very disturbing one, and the question might be why. It's helpful, I think, to have a little context. Naipaul, as you know, eventually won a Nobel Prize, also controversial. He made his first trip to India in 1962. He had already been quite successful with a book of short stories and a novel that were located in Trinidad, where he came from, where he was born. But he had also gone to Oxford and then stayed on to live in England, very determined to build a literary career and not go back to Trinidad, which he thought of as a very culturally second-rate, marginal place. But he was suffering from a crisis that's not uncommon for a young writer who feels he's played out the intimate subject matter of his own early life, and he was not sure where he could go from there. And it was a time when the discovery of roots got very fashionable for writers. And Naipaul got the idea that he might get a new energy for his own career by going in quest of his roots in India, because he came from a family and belonged to the community of Indians in Trinidad who had derived from a late 19th century migration of indentured laborers from India to Trinidad. But he had never been to India, although he'd grown up in an Indian family and in the Indian community. So he goes off there. But the trip was something of a disaster compared to his expectation, because he really was repulsed by almost everything in India and had a little mini nervous breakdown even, I could think to say. So rather than a celebratory reconnection to roots, the book survives as a classic of a different sort, of a classic of homelessness, of rootlessness, in post-colonial literature, which has actually been imitated by a lot of writers since then. So you could say that the trip and the writing of the book did reanimate his literary career as he went on to be the writer of post-colonial homelessness. in many ways. But there still is there's a literary problem in this book, and sometimes a book can seem fresh and valuable, and at the same time you can see what's the matter with it. And what's the matter with this book, and I would call it even a literary problem, other kind of problem too, intellectual and literary problem, is that this vivid drama of his failure, his personal failure and alienation, alternates with other sections that purport to be a very rational and objective judgment of a place, as though he is a cosmopolitan intellectual who can give a fair assessment, he loves that word, of India. The mixture makes for a jumble, but what is best about it and what survives most vividly, I think, is the sometimes comic and sometimes shockingly candid narrative of this failure, as if the novelist in Naipaul were half willing to turn himself into a fictive persona, a not very appealing figure who wants to assess India with rational authority, but is disabled from doing so because of the darkness that he discovers in himself as much as in the India that he encounters. So that's how I think the book as a whole works. The chapter I gave you to read culminates this failed quest for reconnection to roots. It's the final chapter in the book. I think I gave you even where he goes on the airplane afterwards, though I'm not going to talk about that part. He saves the visit to his ancestral village, his grandfather's village, to the last chapter of the book and to the end of the trip, where his whole commitment to discovering his roots has sunk. It's sunk to the level of just being a duty. I hope that, as I say, that you've read it and that you've had some reactions to it yourself. So I'll only make a few observations about the shape that he gives to this experience. For the first few pages, the visit seems to go well, better than expected, because this village turns out to be more prosperous than many places he's visited before, and he even reacts to it as picturesque, partly because it does bring memories back from his own youth. He's treated with reverence by an old woman who'd actually known his grandfather, and with the help of a translator, he's able to enjoy hearing a whole saga, a whole recitation of his grandfather's story of leaving India, of coming back, of getting killed, getting sick and dying on his way, leaving again, but most of all, his continuing generosity and material beneficence to this village from the eventual prosperity he had achieved in Trinidad and sent money back. Naipaul calls his mood after he made that first visit exalted, and you can see that in the way he reacts to the bazaar in the town. He's staying in a hotel, which is interesting. He's not staying in that village. And he writes, "And walking that day in the bazaar, I saw the harmoniums, one of which had lain broken and unused, part of the irrecoverable past in my grandmother's house, the drums, the printing blocks, the brass vessels. Again and again I had that sense of dissolving time, that alarming but exhilarating sense of wonder at my physical self." The language here seems to me deliberately mystifying, as if this mood that he's in won't bear simpler labeling. There's something about the way that it's picturesque that requires him even to be mystifying. India had never been more than a mythic, insubstantial presence in his childhood, but now, almost as in a dream, these half-remembered images come back as though they're getting a new real quality and what seems like a real present. Well, this mood doesn't last very long, because next thing that happens is that this all too real figure of Ramachandra Doob, who is the current head of this family, shows up uninvited at his hotel, and he's a gaunt, beseeching figure, and he's very insistent, and he's not picturesque at all. He is too demanding. And the exalted mood breaks, and Naipaul quickly becomes impatient to the point of rudeness, and he entreats. He's accompanied by a whole bevy of Indian Administrative Service, IAS, cadets, and they are providing the translation and help to him as he is trying to deal with the situation. But he tells them, make him go away. And then the scene turns farcical, though, because he seems to go away. Naipaul takes a shower as if to wash off this whole unpleasant experience, and then this spectral figure of Ramachandra comes back scratching on the window outside the hotel room, and he's like a hallucination, except that it's all too real. The IAS people are gone, so Naipaul has to deal with it alone, and we see how he retreats to arrogant rudeness. He talks to him in English, even though he knows he can't understand English, and he says to him, "We will talk in the village," I said in English. "Now go home. You travel too much." Of course, the man doesn't understand what he's saying. So by signs, I persuaded him to edge away from the window. Quickly then, I drew the curtains. So that speaks for itself. And that revulsion and withdrawal just gets stronger. He waits several days before he goes back to the village, and when he finally goes back, his behavior is really terrible. And I read a little of it. Naipaul presents it all in dialogue. He is not guiding us on how to feel about this, though it's pretty clear. The IIS friend is saying, translating and softening up this in both directions. He says God has sent you to him, my IAS friend said. We'll see. The IAS man converted this into a formal greeting. Would you like to eat something in his poor hut? No. You must at least have some water. I'm not thirsty. You are rejecting his hospitality because he is a poor man. He can take it that way. A mouthful of food. Tell him it is late. Tell him you have to investigate that embezzlement of the National Defense Fund you were telling me about. He says God has sent you to him today. I don't think I can keep this up much longer. Ask him what he wanted to see me about. He says he won't tell you until you eat something in his poor hut. Tell him goodbye. He believes you might appreciate a little privacy, and this just goes on this way until Ramachandra gets to the point, which is that he is involved in a little bit of litigation, and it's gotten into a bit of trouble, and it's cost him 200 rupees, and he's short of cash, and he needs that, and Naipaul is not going to respond, and the sense of him is just getting more and more panicked and withdrawn and tight. But that solves his problems. He can simply forget the new litigation. How can he forget it? This new litigation concerns you. Me? And he explains that it's about the grandfather's land, and unless he gets some money, and if he loses the land, he won't be able to take care of the village, and who will look after your grandfather's shrines. And they go on this way for a while, and then Naipaul describes himself as being overwhelmed, and he just basically flees the village, and it ends. My visit had thrown the Brahmins into a frenzy of activity. Too much had been assumed. I felt overwhelmed. I wished to extricate myself at once, and he gets in the car and leaves, and he won't even take somebody else along with him in the car, and off they go. And the chapter ends, so it ended in futility and impatience, a gratuitous act of cruelty, self-reproach, and flight. So the narrative has dramatized this arrogance and rudeness and panic, and at the same time he does make a maybe also exaggerated judgment of it. So I'll be very interested in how you respond to this. My own sense is, first of all, a question. Why is he so absurdly panicked? I think we all hope that we would behave better than this in such a circumstance, but how can we understand the distress that caused him? And as a literary reader, I always am looking at the language for my clues, and here I am drawn to the repeated word possession, that he keeps saying that the Ramachandra figure is trying to possess him. He was demonstrating his possession of me. And then later, Ramachandra kept up with me, smiling, bidding me farewell, proclaiming his possession of me till the last. And that's the difference between this picturesque way that he could feel exalted by his visit to the village, but then this figure is grotesquely animate, making claims on him, coercing him to respond to his specific and pressing needs, what he's presenting it as, desperate needs. And this intense claim on him feels to Naipaul like an overwhelming challenge to his self-possession, as though it threatens his very existence of himself. And I'm drawn to this mainly because I know that Naipaul's almost obsessed with this kind of threat in many of his writings, but it also seems to me a kind of panic that's not limited to him. Thinking back to those probation officers, I would guess that they could respond to this situation as something that they were familiar with. I think many of us are familiar with it even in our more ordinary lives or in any semi-official roles that we perform, where suddenly we are confronted with a challenge, a set of claims that seem to us overwhelming and more than we are ready to respond to. And I am actually interested to know whether this kind of panic corresponds to anything you have had in your own experience. I can feel that I experienced this several times in my trips to India, particularly, but even right here in Wellesley College. So I choose it as an example of how the art of literature has a capacity in a much more private and personal way of calling out within us as readers, giving form not just to visions of happiness, but to our most shameful feelings, feelings that we might not even wish to confess to others or maybe even acknowledge within ourselves, and yet given form in writing as expressive as Naipaul is able to do, making it something we can contemplate, in this case, even with scorn, even with laughter and a sense, oh, we would never do that. However, no, it's become much more common to endorse literature for its power to deepen our understanding of others, especially others who are worse off than we are, less privileged, poorer. But I decided to emphasize here among the many important points, because I think that is important, but this is a different power of literature, I think, to enable us to recognize, tolerate, and more deeply understand difficult features of ourselves, especially those cast when we are cast in the role of an authority or a potential savior or somebody who is going to bring a policy that's going to transform the lives of suffering people. And so I'm not thinking in my talk so much about what power writers might have in the world at large in a public sense, but what power the reading of literature can have to you as you study global affairs, and even more as you are out there in the world having experiences and having dilemmas and making mistakes and feeling that overwhelming claims are being made on you. You can remember Naipaul's experience, and it might give you some relief. That's all I have to say. Well, I'm very eager to hear your own reactions, either to what I was saying or if you want to go back to some of the questions that this might seem either related to or whatever is on your mind.
Hi, my name is Crystal, and I guess I just wanted to ask more about the program, literature and the professions, and the outcomes of the different talks and the different, I guess, groups that you've worked with or that you've seen or heard of in terms of connecting literature with professions that don't necessarily have intrinsic connections with literature.
Yes, one thing that I intended to say that, well, there's two different things I want to say in relation to that. One thing I forgot to mention was that the literature that was chosen to do in this program that I participated in had less to do with actual experiences that the professional people were in than even the choices I made from India. So they might read this Untitled chapter and they're probation officers. So the idea was not to find literature that was specifically about their profession, but more, and I think it was chosen this way, more about the dilemmas of being in positions of power and authority. So that was the goal and the idea of this program, which in itself was very successful, and the reason I was no longer able to be part of it was that it got removed to New York and expanded. But the larger and now widespread program of literature in the professions, I think it's still called that, is different, and it tends to stay much more closely with situations and cases, and it has that particular goal of making human the stories of sick people or poor people, or and it isn't as much involved in inviting self-reflection as what I was emphasizing. But I think that it has been it's very valued by people who do it, that they do find that having lawyers read about actual poor people, not necessarily in contemporary literature. Dickens, for example. Martha Nussbaum's written a whole book about this. I think myself that she often simplifies the novels to emphasize, make them more empathetic. The goal of the book is to bring out empathy for the poor, whereas that isn't necessarily what Dickens might be doing. But that still, so much professional training is with extremely impersonal, depersonalized, the training of medical students, so much now technological and data-driven that it is possible, or it has been felt that physicians don't know how actually to listen to people, and that listen to people's own stories or have an imagination of what it might feel until the doctor gets sick himself. Then the doctor scientists often write a book about what it was like actually to be sick. So stories and the power of stories has become very crucial in so many areas of training and understanding of life. But it is a very instrumental way of using the story for an almost predetermined end. If a story showed you some reason for having a lack of empathy, well, I don't think that would get picked. Maybe I'm being unfair to those programs. I liked the one I was in.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, and I wanted to thank you for your lecture because it was really inspiring, especially just thinking about subjecthood and the way that in the literature that we've read as Albright Fellows already here, I feel like there's a great danger in painting people who have less or are from different places as victims and not as agents of their own lives. And I think the examples that you've talked about show that there's so much gray space and there's so much complexities to a person, to a subject, that constitute them rather than just being defined by the way that people in power portray them. And I guess my question would then be, in your opinion, how do you see that disconnect being bridged in the field right now in literature? And do you see people who don't have access to literature, who don't have the privilege to imagine doing that right now? And I guess just in your knowledge and expertise, what would you say to that?
Well, I hesitate to pronounce on that because my knowledge would be very much that of an outsider. One of the limitations that I felt in the Catherine Boo book was that she talks about this a little bit for a paragraph in the epilogue of the book, that she has strenuously resisted saying anything about herself in that book and about how she felt there 4 years, an American woman who doesn't even speak the language. What was it like there? How was she reacting really to these people? She just says they got used to her and so they approached her with curiosity. So you don't fully understand, well, were there things she didn't understand about the people? Or what it was that whole drama is absent from the book. So my impulse, based on not so much knowledge, is to think that the moral absolutes of right and wrong are much less commonly held by those who are actually in this situation where everybody is doing some form of thievery, whether it's cheating the electric company or taking somebody's motorcycle, and that there is less of that degree of impulsive, the worthy poor and the unworthy poor. That goes back a long way in our own history. Those terms were used in the 19th century. So I think there's more people are living in the gray area more than outsiders might imagine, or else they will condemn the whole society. One of the things in Muinudin's book is and why a figure like Nawabdin is someone that he does present for us to like, is that survival there depends on figuring out some way to get some extra money that you can't get from your salary. And so he is not a moral absolutist about that. I think the danger and what is more on my mind is a whole range of ways that one can be complacent. When one tries to think about these topics from the outside, one can be complacent about the degree to which your own life is always the right path. As the way Nawabdin says, I've always done the right thing, you've always done the wrong thing. And so I think some self-criticism is being encouraged there for the reader to reflect on the moral gray zones in one's own life. But I do think that, well, what do others think? I don't want to be the only one tense, but do anyone else have a comment about well, they came up about whether the stereotype of the poor is being promoted by policymakers or by literature itself. I think that there is an avoidance of stereotype in both the readings I chose. Yes.
I guess one of my responses to the first text, The Nawabdin Electrician, was how they were essentially portraying, we didn't get too much of the robber of the motorcycle at the end, but we can, I guess, imagine that his circumstances were not entirely created on his own. It was a systematic, I guess, situation of his situation. So it presents two different pictures of what can be done, potentially, with Nawabdin being creative. We can say creative in terms of making a living versus the situations that drive people to act in desperation. So I guess it's a critique of what can happen based on your surroundings and how different outcomes can come about that. And hopefully we would think that in these situations there would be more Nawabdins than the robbers, but the moral, I guess, the underlying morality of it is still that people are trying to survive and they're trying to find a means. And it was interesting that you said, is opening political channels necessarily the main value of this type of literature? And it's interesting to think about that. Is political action, or is it the most effective means of combating these types of situations?
Hi, my name is Farheen, and I'm actually a resident of India and Mumbai. So I think it's very interesting, the pieces you gave us to read and your perspective on this. I just had a comment in terms of the call to action discussion that you brought about and whether this should be the main value that literature gives us. Another form of literature, movies can be interpreted as another form of literature. And a few years ago, a movie called Rang De Basanti was inspired a lot of change in India.
Can you say something about that movie?
Yes. So this movie was basically tied in really well about the history of India and inspired, in the movie, it inspired the youth, who are typically very apathetic, to do something about a corrupt system of government which they did not like. And by depicting this in a movie, it inspired young people like myself in India, all across Mumbai, in Delhi, to really protest against things we thought were not acceptable. And if you look at the events that have happened over India since that movie, it has been all about young change makers coming to front and fighting for their rights. So fighting against corruption, fighting against rape, fighting against issues that have been so perpetrated in Indian society that no one has traditionally done anything about it before. And literature like this has had the power to change an apathetic person into someone to make action. So,
well, I think that's terrific. Is that movie shown in this country? Is it?
I think so. It's fairly popular.
Name? Does it have an English title, or transliterated?
I don't know.
No.
I could find out. But
yeah,
the point I'm trying to make is, while we question whether whether opening political action is the main value, I think it may not be the main value, but it's a value that has the most impact. Whether it may not make an impact on a policymaker standpoint, but it empowers people who traditionally felt not empowered to make a difference. And
I think that's terrific. Mm-hmm. I think it's wonderful, and it's very difficult to see how a grassroots movement like what you're talking about may grow into a real force. We're seeing this right now in India with the rape trial, and one can see how whether that works eventually to have a force. And I really wouldn't want to be saying that the sole power of literature, or maybe even more film, or something that has a wider audience than the kind of literature that I'm talking about, may have an even more effective public power. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jessica, and it would seem that the protagonist in the story, Area of Darkness, is suffering from culture shock and that he is showing symptoms of alienation, emotional withdrawal, and depression. And my question to you is, do you think the aim of stories like this are to engage the reader to think critically about culture shock and to also show how it can be an impediment to improving societal and international relations?
Well, I think culture shock is a very big reality. It's gotten to be something of a cliche, but I think it is true. And I think that Naipaul, when he went to India on the idea that he's discovering his roots, he had many shocks. He had the shock of just how different it was from, he'd been living in England, but he had an opposite shock that was even worse for him, which was that he looked like everybody else. And that was one of his first shocks that really upset him, that he was no different. And he felt that he was a nobody. And so he both wanted to be accepted within there, but he also didn't want to be. So there's a deep inner conflict about whether he does want to be part of this culture or he doesn't want to be. So that's a special kind of culture shock, but one that's not unique to him. But I think that, I don't know what, when you go off on your internships, some of you are going to places you're more familiar with, and some of you I can know from seeing you and looking at your little bios, that you are from a variety of international places. Maybe you've had culture shock coming here. But in internships, you are likely to experience some unpredictable things. And how much preparation you think is useful to you, or how much you receive or not, is interesting. I know, having encountered former students when I was with the Wellesley student trip to India, I met up with one of my former students who was from Delhi, and she's back there living in Delhi, but she'd been here for a number of years, and she was telling me that every time she goes into a shop, it's immediately apparent that she has not been living in India. And even if she's dressed as an Indian, in her Indian clothing, just the way she walks, the way she carries herself, are you agreeing with that? And it's very uncomfortable because she's right away treated differently. And so there are all different kinds of feelings of cultural displacement that global life produces. And I did read a very extensive orientation guide that was written by the head of the University of Wisconsin study abroad program years ago, but it struck me as so wise for American students going abroad and the expectations of what you talk to peers about, what kinds of questions you ask them about, and how you can go wrong and how you can make mistakes. Not blaming you, but just, keep this in mind and not do things that end up embarrassing you a great deal. Maybe So culture shock, yes. Actually, Naipaul wrote another book about India just recently, few years back, called A Million Mutinies Now. Actually, it's maybe 10 years back, in which he totally disowns this book and says he was having a nervous breakdown. And And he goes totally in the opposite direction in ways that seem equally objectionable, in which he just embraces everything, whether it's the Civ Sena or whatever it is, it's all wonderful, as sort of compensating for having thought that everything is terrible. Yes?
I just had a comment on the critique that you read us of Boo's book. And just because the critique was that the book did not offer any political options to its readers, but then I wonder, are we trying to, or is the person who wrote the critique trying to suggest that all literature ought to be giving us is tips on what to do, and whether we're trying to cede our own responsibilities to imagine options and to actually imagine things to do from what we read. Yes.
I'm not quite sure I understood what you meant. You said cede responsibility?
Yes. Turn it over to the book and expect the book to give us everything that we are supposed to do to react to situations and so on. I think literature ought to be inspiring us so that we imagine then change. But the critiques seem to suggest that Boo had failed in some way for not giving tips on what to do after reading about Anawadi, the slum that she wrote about.
This world and the political situation does resemble the one that emerges from the collection of Daniel Muinudin's stories. So the pervasiveness of corruption that goes through the police, the judges, even the NGOs that are involved in supposedly helping these slum people. They're all getting payoffs, and so the difficulty of finding a public policy is, where do you even begin? How do you even connect to it? My husband is about to go to Singapore for 2 weeks and teach medical ethics, and he's buried in books about Singapore, one of them written by the former Prime Minister, who describes a visit to India that he made. And the first thing he talks about is rampant corruption, and he lists all of the ways, including disassembling the electric grid, not paying the electric company. So his view is what you need is to become more like Singapore, where they don't have corruption and they don't put you in jail for everything. And yet, there it is. That's a public policy. But it is such an interwoven system that I think as a reader, it's possible to end up full of sympathy, full of good feeling about these people, and think, well, where would one begin to change that? Now, I mean, young people may say, well, you don't have to change it all at once. You could change it by not deciding that you yourself will not get involved in corruption. That would be one way. But I think there is a way that other more radical critics of going back to the critics of Victorian literature, where there was book after book and novel all about the miseries of the poor. And there's a critic who says that it got to be a feeling of self-satisfaction in people, that the idea they were learning something more, but they already knew. It wasn't as though they didn't know that there were poor people who were suffering. They knew it. But by reading another book about it and by feeling the empathy, that can become a substitute for actually doing something that is different. And I think maybe that's a little what you are implying by ceding the responsibility to the book. No. What do you think it would be the way of accepting responsibility? Okay. Yes.
My name is Chiu, and I vehemently agree that the purpose of the literature does not originally lies in directly inciting any public policy in its concrete, detailed manner, but inciting
the reader to reflect upon the moral dilemma and understand the gray zone from which we should start making the policy and communication. But I think because what the general appeal that the literature has is that kind of universal appeal to the human nature rather than the specific details of the background. For example, reading Crime and Punishment, we think about the moral dilemma rather than the status of Russian students and alcoholism. So I think the same kind of result can ensue from these modern contemporary literature dealing with the very pressing issues of global issues. And I think that kind of generalization is the power of literature, but also what inhibits us from reacting to it directly rather than metaphysically. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what writers should do differently, or if writers should have different purpose in mind rather than to have a universal appeal to human nature.
I think that both the writers that I were writing about, talking about, and especially the Naipaul when he wrote this book, I don't think that he expected that his description of him going into a panic when the claim was made on him that he couldn't tolerate, I don't think he wanted to think of this is a human universal situation. I think he knew that he reacted in an excessive way. But I would say, and I think maybe Larry Rosenwald said something like this, that if it's good enough writing, then something fundamental in human nature is likely to be there. And that's what makes a book like that, like even Area of Darkness, survive, even when its particular observations about the Indian plumbing system or something seem outdated. The sense of human nature that he rather candidly exposes touches. You can recognize things in it, even while you think he's he's far gone character. But the universality is something that comes through even when it's not intended, and it really does have to do with what literature survives far past the particular circumstances in which it was written. If the personality, the character was just so local to a particular time and place, after a while it would no longer appeal. One more. Okay.
And I'm from Pakistan. So like Farheen, I have a small comment to make. I thought both pieces were very inspiring, both on Pakistan and India. And as I was reading these pieces, I would say I was slightly bitter about how Naipaul was writing these, because I was like, the way he's portraying our country is like not right. But then I sat back and thought about it, and I was like, but this is true. This is what happens. And whenever I go back,
which is what happens,
like all these issues which they can raise, like both in the Pakistani piece and in the Indian piece, because like every time I go back to my country, I remember one time I went back and there was assassination of Benazir Bhutto. The next time I went back, the whole government changed. The third time I went back, I remember there was floodings in Pakistan, and the most recent encounter in Pakistan was like, there wasn't any electricity for 16 hours and we have no gas and no water right now. So it just inspired me to like look at the issues within myself and also within the country. And I thought both these pieces like brought forth these issues very like they were like very well articulated, because I felt it kind of motivated me to like do more work on these issues. And as a resident of Pakistan, I think now when I think about it, I think I'll go back and like, talk more about these pieces and more about these issues with other fellows.
Well, I think that's good. And could I just have time to make one more comment about a question that came up earlier about readership, audience? And I think as I teach this literature to students, many of whom are from South Asia, and read reviews as well, this is true not just India and Pakistan, but every group has a kind of self-protectiveness. And there's a lot of nervousness when works that seem critical of any of that culture or of that country are published to a readership outside. And there's a defensiveness about that. And as I say, that's not limited to that group. I think any group, a religious group, a racial group, a national group. And so I think it takes a lot of reflection, especially if you're in that foreign place, not to become too defensive and to accept it, but also for the other people not to see, oh yes, that's the whole truth about that place. So there's a lot of tension between the people who know that place from the inside and how readers from the outside will react. And it's a fascinating phenomenon. I don't think it's something that we ever can or even should just strive to avoid, but it is something that has to be acknowledged and worked on. So I'm glad you bring that up.